his computer. Okay, and then we're going to
I see it.
Okay, you see it? Okay.
Yes.
I don't see anybody else coming. As I said, what I did is that I made a chronology, got a chronology in reference to our dates, the Persian time, and also in reference to Hellenistic time, beginning in 612 BC and going all the way down to 31 BC. And that will be on the new notes that you'll get. And it's just some historical things, and we'll talk about all those historical things eventually. And so, but we've gotten through with Unit 1. We talked about the historical survey of the Hebrew nations from its beginning to the end of the Babylonian captivity. And we looked at the Jews at the close of the Old Testament period, contrasted with the Jews at the opening of the New Testament period. And notice some of the things that's going on there that was not there, then was there, in reference to like the synagogue, so forth, and speaking the Koine Greek, and also having the Septuagint. So we'll talk more about those things as we go through. And also, I gave a brief introduction to some of the books of the Apocrypha. Again, they were the places that I got those are in the notes, and you can actually go online and pick those up. Even more so if you want to read those things. But again, we're looking from the historical standpoint of those books to help us to understand some of the things that went on between the testaments. And so we talked about those, and we'll talk also about some of the pseudographia. Also, eventually, some of them, we can't talk about all of them, but if you have the Apocrypha, you may want to glance down and read some of that. I've been trying to read it. I've never read all of them, but I read some of them. The Maccabean period is the one that we spend a lot of time in reading. But we talked about those things. Also, a knowledge of the biblical history periods necessary in order to properly understand the intertestament period. We talked about from the beginning of time to the inauguration of that of Israel under the law of Moses, 2,500 years. Also, we look at from the beginning of the judges of Israel to the beginning of the kings of Israel, 305 years. And from the division of the kingdom to the fall of Israel, or the divided kingdom, from 975 BC to 722 BC, that's 253 years. 722 BC is an important date because that's when they went off in the Assyrian captivity. We talked some about the Assyrian captivity. We're going to talk some about also the Babylonian captivity. And we looked up how that the kingdom eventually, Rehoboam and Jeroboam, the kingdom split into two different groups. And so the Rehoboam group and also Jeroboam group went off in idolatry. That's the 10 tribes. And we would find that Jeroboam was the one that went about to erect some changes in that of Israel, the place of worship, time of worship, object of worship, even changed the priesthood. In the chronology that I gave at the very beginning, something new is that I found where about the priest, how that they chose the priest, and I just put down the date. And we'll go over some of that as we go through our studies. But there were 19 kings of Israel, and there were 19 kings of Judah. The kings of Israel reigned for about 250 years, and the 19 kings of Judah reigned for almost 400 years. And so we also gave a list of all the kings and the places you can find 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Also, we noticed the books of the prophetic books of the Old Testament in chronological order. We talked about Joel, Jonah, Amos, and Hosea, and Isaiah, and Micah. We talked about from the fall of Israel to the fall of Judah, or to the kingdom of Judah, from 722 down to 587 BC, when they would go off into that of Babylonian captivity. And also we talked about the different kings and the prophets, the prophetic books for that period, and how they were given to us. We made the point of putting them in chronological order: Isaiah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah, Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel. And so we're going to really pick up on some of the kings, but also especially we're going to pick up on that of the book of Daniel and read some things from there. Babylon, the first of the four kingdoms prophesied by Daniel 2, moved up against Judah during the period there. And so we'll talk about the different kingdoms that Daniel talks about in the Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 9. Also, we gave a monarchy for the kings and the prophets for that of Judah and Israel, and where they're found in kings, and also the prophets, who the prophets were during that time, also the Egypt and also Syria. And so we were talking about some of those when our time got away with us. We talked about the three carryings away of Judah to Babylon. There was a 70-year count, and so they were carried off into three different carrying offs into Babylonian captivity. And so the first carrying away of the Jews to Babylon was effected in the third year of Jehoiakim. And then the second carrying away was effected in the first year of the reign of the young king Jehoiachin. And the third carrying away to Babylon was effected in the 11th year of the reign of Zedekiah. But they were all carried off. We looked, again, as I said, in reference to some of the books there, and then we got down to unit number 2. And that's basically where we are. I don't see anybody else that's joined us. And so unit number 2 deals with the historical survey of the Hebrew people from the beginning of the Persian Empire until the rise of the Alexandria the Great, or the Grecian Empire. And so we want to look at that. And I will look at the chronology that's in the very front there, because the Persian period around 612, Nineveh was destroyed by the Medes and also by the Babylonians. But we're talking about in reference to the survey of the Hebrew people from the beginning of the Persian Empire. So we're talking about 612. And and then all the way down to that of the rise of Alexander the Great, and the things that he was actually involved in. So the period of the divided kingdom is concerned especially with the Assyrian nation. And so Shalmaneser the second, he reigned from 859 to 825 BC, and he is to actually be remembered for the fact that instead of contenting himself with mere maids for the sake of booty, he endeavored to organize and administer the countries which his armies subdued. And so he is to be remembered for the fact that during his reign, the Israelites first came in contact with the Assyrian nation. And so there he is in Freed's archaeological book, a black obelisk of Shalmaneser. And it was discovered by Mr. Laird in 1846, and now it's in the British Museum. Jehu, though the destroyer of Omri's dynasty, also appears as his son. So there's some proofs that are given there in reference to archaeological finds that helps us to understand who these leaders were, and also about some dates in reference to when they reigned. There was another inscription found at Crutch on the Tigris River, and now in the British Museum. And it records Shalmaneser II's victory at Karkar on the Orontes River. Over 12 allied kings were led by Ben-Hadad of Syria, including Ahab of Israel, who contributed 700 chariots, 700 horsemen, and 10,000 men in reference to what they were going to do. So this was the 6th year of the reign of Shalmaneser II. But in the 11th year of his reign, the Black Obelisk records a conflict with Hazael, king of Syria. And so again, well, if we were to go back and look at some of the things that we got someone waiting in the waiting room, so where he went. I'm hitting him, he's not doing anything. Okay, Ben, I don't know if you're there. I got you in, but see you. I see him there. He's in the waiting room. in the waiting room. You need to be. All right, here you go. Waiting room again. Oh, admit. There he goes. Okay. He's admitted. I don't know where he's at, but he's admitted there somewhere. Okay, we're recording, and so I see that again come up that we're recording. There's Ben right there, so we are recording. And so when we think about what was really what's going on in reference to this time, in reference to that of Shalmaneser, they made war, and so after Shalmaneser II, the empire fell into a state of decay. So we will find the rise and the fall of a number of these countries. And so Pul, P-U-L, and also he's called Tiglath-Pileser, P-I-L-E-S-E-R, the third or the fourth. The dates there in reference to him, there's some kind of mix-up, 745 to 727 BC. He put an end to the independent kingdom of Hamath. And we find in 2 Kings, if you want to get your Old Testament out and go over to 2 Kings, chapter 15, and down in verse 9, the Bible points out to us there, and we go back to verse 30, in the 30th and 8th year of Azariah, king of Judah, did Zechariah, the son of Jeroboam, reign over Israel and Samaria 6 months, and he did that which was evil in the sight of God, in the sight of the Lord, as his fathers had done. He departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, the sons of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. And so we have that brief reference to his invasion of that of Israel. Menahem was king at the time, and the son and successor of Menahem was slain by Pekah, who usurped the throne. And we find that during the Pekah's day, Tiglath-Pileser, in a fresh descent from the Israelite kingdom, took several cities and transported the inhabitants to that of Syria. In 2 Kings 15, down in verse 29, the Bible says, in the days of Pekah, king of Israel, came Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and took Ijon and Abel, Beth, and Noah, and Kedesh, and Hazor, and Gilead, and Galilee, and the land of Naphtali, and carried them captive to Assyria. And so they went into that of Assyrian captivity. So the Assyrian king chronicled that he transported them over into that of Assyria. And so in 728 BC, Pul, or Tiglath-Pileser, was crowned king of Babylon. And so the following year, though, he died. So that brings us to Shalmaneser IV, around 729 to 721 BC. Now it's important there because in 722 and 721 BC, they was carried off to Assyrian captivity. The 10 tribes were. And so Shalmaneser besieged Samaria, the capital of Israel, for 3 years. When we turn over to 2 Kings chapter 17, the Bible points out there, beginning in verse 1, he says, in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, began Hoshea, the son of Elath, to reign in Samaria over Israel 9 years, and he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, but not as the kings of the Israel that were before him. Against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his servant and gave his presents, and the king of Assyria found some spirits in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and brought no presents of king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him to prison. Then the king of Assyria came up throughout all the land and went up into Samaria and besieged it, he says, for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away unto Assyria and placed them in Halah and in Habor by the river of Gozan and in the cities of the Medes. And so here we find that what was taking place in reference to Shalmaneser. And so the Bible reading at the end of 3 years, they took it in reference to that of Samaria, 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 9 and 10. So the form of expression omitting any reference to the king is explained by the monuments. And so there are monuments in reference to archaeological studies, and we do have a study in archaeological things that we have that we look, and we'll notice some of those things that are in that course. But Shalmaneser died before the siege was completed, and so the city was actually taken by Sargon. And so in Sargon, who reigned 722, 705 BC. I'm sorry, 705. Let me put some on top of that so that thing will quit moving. And so he is mentioned by name in the Old Testament only once, and that's Isaiah 20 verse 1. He completed the siege gained by Shalmaneser IV in 722, and Israel fell in the 6th year of Hezekiah, king of Judah. 2 Kings chapter 18, down in verse 10, he tells us that. But in 705 BC, Sargon was murdered. Now he does not record his defeat. Only his victory. And we find that this is a typical of that of early kings. They didn't talk about their defeats. They always talked about their victories. And so when we put everything together, all of a sudden we see some of their defeats. And so Sennacherib, 704 to 621, 681 BC, I'm sorry. He was Sargon's son, and he had neither the military skill nor the administrative ability of that of his father. He campaigned against Hezekiah, and that was really a failure. And you find that in 2 Kings chapter 18 through 19. But yet we found that Hezekiah goes before Jehovah, and there he prays. Over in 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 14 begins. Here is Hezekiah. It says, and Hezekiah received the letter of the hand of the messengers and read it. And Hezekiah went up to the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. Hezekiah prayed before the Lord and said, O Lord God of Israel, which dwellest between the cherubims, thou art the God, even thou alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth, thou hast made heaven and earth. Lord, thou bow thine ear and hear, and open, Lord, thine eyes and see and hear the words of Sennacherib, which have sent him to reproach the living God. And of a truth, Lord, the king of Assyria has destroyed the nations and their lands, and have cast their gods into the fire, for they were to no gods, but the work of men's hands in wood and stone. Therefore they have destroyed them. Now therefore, O Lord God, our God, I beseech thee, save thou us out of his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that thou art the Lord God, and even thou only. And so here we would find that his prayer. Isaiah would also prophesy that he shall not come up unto the city nor shoot an arrow there. I will defend this city to save it. 2 Kings 19 verses 29 through 34. So that night, the angel of Jehovah smote the camp of the Assyrians, 185,000 men, according to verses 35 through 37 of 2 Kings chapter 19. It says, it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000, and when they had rose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. And it came to pass, as he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch, his god, that Adramelech and Sharezer, his son, smote him with a sword, and they escaped into the land of the Armenian, that would be Ararat, and Esar-Haddon, his son, reigned in his stead, and so he was killed. So that night the angel of the Lord smote all of these, and so Babylon was in constant revolt. And so we would see that in 689 BC that Sennacherib razed Babylon to the ground. In other words, it was destroyed. He was assassinated, though, again by his two sons. There you'll notice in 2 Kings chapter 19 verse 37. And so as Esar-Haddon, 681-669 BC, he was succeeded in his father Sennacherib, and doing so, since Sennacherib had destroyed Babylon, we find that he rebuilt Babylon, made it the second capital, and he is the only Assyrian monarch who actually ruled in Babylon. And so this fact explains what has sometimes called the difficulty in 2 Chronicles chapter 33 and in verse 11. And we would find, and if we would sometimes, if we were studying the harmony of First and Second Samuel, First, Second Kings, First, Second Chronicles, then we'd go back and look at some of those discrepancies, as we would call them, and explain those. But we don't have the time to go back and look at all of those. And so he fought, Esarhaddon had fought and was victorious over the Ethiopian Egyptian king Taharka, 674, 671 BC. And so he died while on his way to repress it, though in Egypt. And so then the king was Ashurbanipal, 669, 626 BC. He succeeded his father, Esarhaddon, to the throne. And Tirhaka, the Ethiopian, was in revolt, and Ashurbanipal drove him back, and for a time there was peace. And so then under Domain, Tirhaka successor, Egypt revolted again. And so the time the Assyrian punishment was merciless, Thebes, Noah, Ammon, according to Nahum 3 verse 8, was destroyed, and the destruction was a bloody destruction. So it was within 10 years of this bloody destruction, and probably immediately after this, that Nahum delivered his burden against that of Nineveh. And Ashurbanipal was an efficient patron of that of learning, so the library of Nineveh owed most of its treasures to him. Most of the treasures were his. We'll make it right here, right quick. There's a mistake right there. And so there was the extravagant luxury had now invaded the court. So the king conducted his wars through his generals while he himself remained at home. He didn't travel. And if we were studying First and Second Samuel, we would see that that was a problem with that of David. That he always went, but then there were times when he did not go. But a revolt headed by the king's brother and the viceroy of Babylonia broke out throughout a greater part of the Assyrian Empire. So here's the Assyrian Empire that is big and strong, but there's a problem. And this revolt was quelled at great cost. Then came the task of conquering the rebel Shias of northern Arabia. And so the struggles had exhausted Assyria, and its fighting population had been killed. Its treasury was empty. And so the people of Samaria were with colonists from the conquered nation. And so we can see that when they fought a lot of these battles, they continued to fight them and fight them and fight them. And eventually, they would, as we would probably say, they would be bankrupt because they lost, they had to pay, and they lost a lot of their money, a lot of their soldiers, a lot of their land, and therefore not a lot of that income. And then we had 606 BC, Sensar Iskam. He was the last king of that of Israel, that of Assyria. And in 606 BC, this last king fell fighting against the Scythians. Now, the Scythians, let me get my New Testament, and I thought this was kind of interesting because over in the book of Colossians, in chapter 2, we find that chapter 3, that is, they're actually mentioned. The Bible says, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond nor free, but Christ is all and in all. And so they're actually mentioned in that of the New Testament, this group of people. But Nineveh was utterly destroyed, never again to be inhabited. Now, there would be things where most likely that there are the areas there where people would camp and so forth, but Nineveh, as where it was located, was not rebuilt at all. So during this period, in the 6-year reign of Hezekiah, king of Judah, Israel was carried into Syrian captivity, never to return. Now, again, when we say that, and the 10 tribes were lost, we have to realize that there was a small group of people. There were a number of people that actually would migrate into the other kingdom, that is the kingdom of Judah and Benjamin. And we will find, if we were to do a study of the lost tribes, we will find that some of those people in that books of the Old Testament and also books of the New Testament. So during that period of time, in the 6th year of the reign of Hezekiah, king of Judah, Israel was carried into Assyrian captivity, so they were never going to return. Now, like Hosea's wife, and Hosea, the prophet Hosea, chapter 3 and verse 3, Hosea's wife, Gomer, whom he brought out of slavery to abide many days, who would not be allowed to play the harlot in order to be a man's wife. And to the children of Israel shall abide many days without king, without prince, without sacrifice, without pillar, without ephod and teraphim. And afterward shall the children of Israel return and seek Jehovah, their God, and David their king, and shall come from with fear unto Jehovah and to his goodness in the latter days. Hosea 3, verses 4 and 5. And so we find that years later, King Josiah, the royal reformer, invited the remnant of Israel of Manasseh and Ephraim to Jerusalem to join in the Reformation. Now, if we were to go over to 2 Chronicles chapter 34, down in verse 8, we find that the chronicle wrote, he says, now in the 18th year of his reign, when he had purged the land and the house, he sent Shaphan, the son of Azaliah, and Manasseh, the governor of the city, and Joab, the son of Joahaz, the recorder, to repair the house of the Lord his God, so that it would be repaired. Also, we would find some evidence of that in 1 Kings 13, also 2 Kings chapter 23. But during the return of the Jews, the Samaritans wanted to build with them. And in the book of Ezra, chapter 4, verse 2, they say, we seek your God as we do sacrifice to him since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us up hither. Ezra 4, verse 2. Zerubbabel and Joshua said, ye have nothing to do with us in building a house unto our God. Ezra 4, verse 3. So the Samaritan woman over in John chapter 4 at the well is a striking example of the condition described by that of Hosea. They just simply did not have anything to do with the Samaritan people. The gospel was preached to the Samaritans. Let's see here, in Acts chapter 1, and if you'll notice there, he talks about all the different people that were there on the day of Pentecost. Then we turn to Acts chapter 8 and verse 5, and Philip goes to Samaria. The gospel was not preached to any Gentiles until the conversion of that of Cornelius in Acts chapter verse 11. So the period of the kingdom of Judah is concerned with that of the Babylonian nation. And so in Hezekiah's day, Babylon was growing in power and becoming ambitious. Baladan, king of Babylon, sent his son Bir-Akbal to Hezekiah on pretense of inquiring of Hezekiah's health. And so in 2 Kings, if we go back there in chapter 20, begin in verse 12 down to verse 21, we find that he deals with this. He says, at that time, Baradak-Badab, the son of Badam, king of Babylon, sent letters and present unto Hezekiah, for he had heard that Hezekiah had been sick. Hezekiah hearkened unto them and showed them all the house of his precious things, the silver and the gold and the spices and the precious ointments and oils and all of the house of armor and all that was in his treasure. There was nothing in his house, so he says, nor in all his dominion that Hezekiah showed them not. He should not have done that, but that's what he did. He showed them everything. Now, Merodach-Baladan talks to revolt against Assyria and did succeed in making Babylon independent twice in 722, 710, and also 703 and 702. And so he visits that of Hezekiah around 712 BC. And so from 606 BC to around 612 BC, the Medes and the Babylonians combined forces and destroyed Nineveh, and the capital of the Assyrian Empire. So apparently, Xerxes, the Mew, they called it, took the lead after the fall of the capital. Nabopolassar, the revolted vassal king of Babylon, fought the Assyrians alone. And so we see the things that are taking place that's going to get us into reference to that of the Persian Empire, the Medes and the Persian, and also to Alexander Gayt. Now, the Medes had been called home by problems that really needed their immediate attention. So they were called home. So the Median and the Babylonian king may have been estranged. Babylon capitalized on Assyria's disaster. And upon Nebuchadnezzar's, Nebuchadnezzar, his son, marched the Babylon armies and annexed the territories which one belonged to Assyria. And so Egypt comes along and they try to resist the Babylon's advance, but Nebuchadnezzar's forces were too strong. And the last kings of Judah were torn between the claims of Egypt and Babylon. So they weren't united, could not even put up a united front. So Jeremiah insisted that resistance to Babylon was futile. And he encouraged Judah to go into Babylon without offering resistance, but he was considered a traitor. When you go and you read Jeremiah 28 and 29, he is actually considered as that of a traitor, but he was not. He was just simply telling them the truth. It was futile. The pro-Egyptian party succeeded in bringing about a series of rebellions. And so we find that the people of Judah were carried away on 3 different occasions, just like the 10 tribes were carried off in the Syrian captivity in 3 different ways. That we find also that so did that of Judah. So number one is that before the death of his father, Nebuchadnezzar had captured Jerusalem and made Judah territory to Babylon. And so this happened during the reign of the Jehoiakim. Over in 2 Kings chapter 24, begin there in verse 1, it says, in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him, and the Lord sent against him bands of the Chaldees, and hands of the Syrians, and the hands of the Moabites, and bands of the children of Ammon, and sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake by his servant the prophet. So the prophets had prophesied that Judah was going to be destroyed, and therefore God brought it about. And so this was before the death of his father, that Nebuchadnezzar captured this and captured that of Judah and brought him to that of Babylon. And so at this time, Daniel was carried to Babylon. Sometimes we talk about David, I forget about that we're not talking about him. Over in the book of Daniel, we find that Daniel is one of the prophets that helps us to understand more about the between the Testament and some things that are taking place. But over, if I can get over that, in Daniel chapter 1, Daniel tells us in Daniel chapter 1, there beginning verse 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, and was part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuch, and he spake, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes, and the children, that is the youth, in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge and understanding and science, and such as ability in them to stand in the king's palace, in whom they might teach the learning and the tongues of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that he at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among them were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for gave them Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and Hananiah the Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and Azariah as Abednego. And so that was their names, and how that their names were actually changed. And so the second carried away, though, in reference to Babylonian captivity, in the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, 597 BC, he moved up against Jerusalem. Now, again, and over in 2 Kings chapter 24, beginning verse 8, going down to verse 17, we find that Jehoiakim was king, and Jehoiakim, after a 3-month reign, was carried off to captive to that of Babylon. And Ezekiel was carried to Babylon at that same time. Now, again, remember, Ezekiel is carried, and so we read about that of Daniel in reference to him, but Daniel was in the court there, remember, of Nebuchadnezzar. But we find that when we go back and we read about Ezekiel in chapter 1, beginning in verse 1 of Ezekiel, that the Bible says, now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives of the river of Chebar, and the heavens were open, and I saw visions of God. In the 5th day of the month, which was the 5th year of the king's year, Jehoiakim's captivity, the word of the Lord came expressly unto Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, and in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Chebar, and the hand of the Lord was there upon him. And so we find that you have like Daniel in the courts, but you have Ezekiel out in the country. So you have two prophets there. It's prophesied. Then the third part of the carrying away was Nebuchadnezzar came up against Jerusalem, and the third time during the 9th year of the reign of the puppet Mattaniah, and Jehoiakim's brother, whose name was changed to Zedekiah, 2 Kings 24 and verse 17. The city was under siege until the 11th year, 2 Kings 25 and verse 2. So Zedekiah's sons were killed before his eyes. In other words, he saw them being killed, as we said, before his eyes. Then they put Zedekiah's eyes out, and he was carried over into Babylon, 2 Kings 25 and verse 7. Now, Nebuzaradan, captain of the guard and son of Nebuchadnezzar, burned the city, including the temple, in the 11th year of Zedekiah, 2 Kings 24 verse 8. So from the first carried away under Jehoiakim until the fall of Babylon was a period of 70 years. So the rulers of the Neo-Babylon Empire included the following. You had Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar, Evil-Merodach, Nebuchadnezzar, Labar-Sarohad, Nabonus. Now, Nabonus, I'll just stop back and talk about him. Sir Rawlinson II discovered and inscribed a cylinder of King Nabonidus, on which he expressly named Belshazzar as the eldest son. Now, another cylinder of the same king states that the son of Nabonidus was appointed commander of his forces, and this son is the Belshazzar of Daniel. We were to go over to Daniel and to help us to again see what's going on in that time, because we're getting closer and closer to the ends of the books of the Old Testament. In Daniel chapter 5 there, that we find that he talks about that of Daniel, the son of Belshazzar of Daniel in chapter 5. And Belshazzar the king made a great feast to the thousands of the lords and drank wine before the thousands. Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and the silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken of the temple which was in Jerusalem. Here the things are taken from Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines drank in them. So in other words, they took everything they possibly could and they used it, even though that it was holy in the sense that it was made for the purpose of worshiping Jehovah God, but yet they had ransacked everything. They brought it to that of Babylon. And so we find even in chapter 7 in verse 1 that it says in reference, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sums of the matter. And also in chapter 8 verse 10, we'll talk some about those. Chapter 8 verse 10, and it waxed, he says, great, even to the host of heaven, and it came down some of the hosts and some of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. So we'll talk about some of those. The point being is that the co-regent with his father was killed by the Medes and the Persians around 538 BC. And so there were some facts though concerning Nabonidus. No, I can't say his name. It's Nabonidus. He was an able and accomplished ruler. And you can see that when you read about him. He left many records of his 18 years of reign, but he was a placid, inert disposition. He was adverse to the cares of the state. Belshazzar, accordingly, acted as his father's viceroy, but Nabonidus had married into Nebuchadnezzar's family, and Belshazzar of Daniel 5 was thus considered a son or descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. He was thus considered, let me take that back, considered a son nor descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. So Nabonidus delighted in exploring and restoring ancient temples. And so for this and other similar reasons, he placed his son at the head of the state. And so Nabonidus, Nabonidus desired to centralize the religions of Babylonia. And so he brought to Babylon many of the images of deities from other cities that were conquered by the Babylonians, and this greatly displeased the people and excited a strong feeling against them. The priesthood was alienated because of all of that. The military party was displeased with him because he left the defense of the emperor to others, or the empire to others. And the stage was set for the entrance of Cyrus, the Persian. And so that brings us, according to our unit, our outline, is that Cyrus, the second 558, 529 BC, the Persian, enters that of Babylon. Now, when he enters in that of Babylon, Babylon fell around 538 BC, and some say 536 BC. I actually was taught 536 BC. So you can see, again, about that of dates sometimes that we don't be a stickler on that of dates unless we find archaeological studies. But Belshazzar fell in Babylon, and we find that Nabonidus, who had left for Haran at that time, Cyrus revolted against the Medes, and he died 5 years later. So here comes Isaiah now, about 750 BC. Isaiah had previously prophesied that Babylon would fall. That is, it would arise, but it would also fall, become desolate. And so Isaiah prophesied concerning that of the rise, though, now of Cyrus. Now it's very interesting. If you go over to the book of Isaiah, go over to Isaiah chapter 41, drop down to verse 2. It says there, who raised up the righteous man from the east, called him to his foot, gave the nation before him, and made him ruler over kings. He gave them as a dust of his sword and as a driven stubble to his bow. He pursued them and passed safely, and by the way that he had not gone with his feet, who hath wrought and done. He says, calling the generations from the beginning, I, the Lord, the first, and with the last, I am he. The isles saw it and feared. The ends of the earth were afraid, drew near, and came. And so we find there, and there are many other passages that talks about how that God would raise someone from that of the east to take care of that of Babylon. And so God would raise up one from that of the north. Now, if you go down to chapter 41, beginning in verse 25, he says, I have raised up from one from the north, and he shall come. From the rising of the sun shall he call upon my name, and he shall come upon princes and upon mortar and the potter and tread clay, who have declared from the beginning that we may know, and before time that we may say he is righteous. Yea, then is none that showeth, yea, there is none that declareth, yea, there is none that heareth your words, he says. The first shall say to Zion, behold, behold him then, and I will give to Jerusalem one that bringeth good tidings. For I beheld, there was no man, either among them, and there was no
a counselor that when I asked of them, it could answer word, behold, they are all vanity and their works are nothing. Their molten images are wind and confusion. And so he talks about in reference to that, they will come from that of the rising of the sun. So that Judah shall be inhabited and that Cyrus will do God's pleasure. Now watch this in chapter 44 of the book of Isaiah. He talks about that of Cyrus, names him. That what's going to take place. Now again, Isaiah prophesied 750 BC, but what's going to take place is after 536 BC. And so he begins there in chapter 44, beginning verse 24. Thus saith the Lord thy Redeemer, and he that formed thee from the womb. I am the Lord that maketh all things, that stretcheth forth the heavens alone, that spreadeth against the earth by myself, that frustrateth the tokens of the liars, and maketh thy diviners mad, that turneth the wise men backward, and maketh their knowledge foolish, that confirmeth the word of his servant, and performeth the counsel of his messengers. Thus saith the Jerusalem, thou shalt be inhabited, and the cities of Judah, you shall be built, and I'll raise up the decayed places thereof. Then saith to the deep, be dry, and will dry up thy rivers. Then saith that of Cyrus. Now here he mentions Cyrus. He is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. Now here is Jehovah God said that Cyrus, who was not a Jewish person, but Cyrus is going to be his shepherd. And so that in order to prove that God is God, he was saying before time to this in reference to that of this anointed Cyrus in chapter 45 there, beginning in Isaiah 45 verse 1, and especially, and I'm not going to read all that, but verse 4, he says, for Jacob my servant's sake, and Israel my elect, I have even called thee by thy name, and I have named thee, though thou hast not known me, he said. So therefore, he simply points that out to us that Judah had been inhabited and that Cyrus would do God's pleasure. That in order to prove that God is God, he was saying before time to the anointed Cyrus, I have called thee by thy name. I have surnamed thee. Thou hast not known me. And so that Babylon would be without a throne, Isaiah 47, beginning verse 1. So Isaiah prophesied during the reign of Uzziah, Ahaz, and Jotham, and Hezekiah. That's around 740 to 701 BC. And we find that the kings following Isaiah number one was that of Manasseh. He reigned for 55 years, 2 Kings 18 beginning. And also Josiah reigned for 31 years, 2 Kings chapter 21. Joahaz, he reigned 3 months, 2 Kings 23 beginning verse 30. Then Jehoiakim reigned 11 years, 2 Kings 23. Then Jehoiakim reigned 3 months, 2 Kings 24 and verse 6. And then Zedekiah, he reigned for 11 years, 2 Kings 24 verse 13 beginning. So a minimum of 160 years elapsed from the close of Isaiah's ministry to the capture of Babylon by Cyrus in 538, 536 BC. So here it is that it's been prophesied, 740, that Cyrus is going to be the one. And yet here we find, as we're reading the latter part of the Old Testament, before we get into between the Testament, showing us the history there, that what takes place, how that God using these different nations to bring about what Daniel had prophesied and what Daniel had seen in Daniel 2, Daniel 5, and Daniel 7. And so the predictive element of Isaiah's prophecy is remarkable. There are two theories that relate to theories relating to predictive prophecy. Number one is that the prophet is spokesman for God and often sets forth future events. Now, we do know, if we were to read in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 18, verses 18 through 22, that when these prophets prophesied, if what they prophesied did not come to pass, then they were a false prophet. You were not supposed to hear it. But now, if whatever he prophesied, if he prophesied it and it came to pass, they were supposed to hear what he had to say. Now, the other is that a prophet is always a person of a particular time, speaking to the people of a particular time concerning matters of interest for the particular time. But the predictive element is accounted for by those of the latter persuasion on the following basis: a change in situation and a change in scope. Now, Daniel prophesied of the rise of 3 other world empires after Babylon, according to Daniel chapter 2. We were to go over to Daniel chapter 2. And we find that Daniel deals with those. Let me put on my spectaculars here to look at this. We find in Daniel chapter 2 there, beginning down in verse 31, thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass. So you have that of the Babylonian there, fine gold. You have that of the Medo-Persian arms of silver and so forth. And he talks about that of the brass, and also talks about legs of iron, the Roman Empire. So he talks about all these different empires and the idea of them. Daniel does, and points those out to us. So many years later, he prophesied that Babylon was to be divided between the Medes and the Persians. In Daniel 5, beginning verse 25, here's Daniel's prophecy in reference to them. He says, and this is the writing that was written, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of it. Mene, God has numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. And Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So we find that he prophesies, then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet or purple, excuse me, and put a chain of gold around his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler of the kingdom. And in that night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. So we find there that he points out to us in reference to that of the Medes and Persians, that it would be divided between that of the Medes and the Persians. So that very night, Belshazzar was slain, Daniel chapter 5, verse 30. And so Darius received the kingdom being about 62 years old. Now notice verse 30 and 31. He says, in the night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius, the Median, took the kingdom being about 62 years old. That's 538 to 536 BC. So the kingdom of Babylon was divided up between the Medes and the Persians. And so Darius received the kingdom. This Darius is thought to be Gabarus, governor of the Turkestan. And this would mean that Cyrus placed Gabarus in charge of Babylon as king of the city until he himself could assume the sovereignty of that. So this information has been conjectured from that of the Babylonian Chronicle. Now, there are numerous things of reference to history, archaeological finds in reference to the Babylonian Chronicle. And so the conjecture is this, that Gabarus, Darius, was the vice king in question. And so Cyrus was a great general and an administrator. When we read and we study about him, Cyrus first appeared in history at the age of 40, and then he inherited the small kingdom of Anshai, 559 BC. And this territory was tributary to that Median Empire of the eastern of Babylon. So in 550 to 549 BC, Cyrus revolted against Astyages, his Median overlord, and Astyages sent an army up to Pargus against that of Cyrus. And Pargus, remembering how Astyages had cruelly slain his son, deserted with most of his soldiers to that of Cyrus. So then Astyages personally left an army against Cyrus. His second army muted against Astyages and handed him over to Cyrus. So Nabonidus formed a coalition with Babylon and Egypt and Lydia and attacked Cyrus. And Croesus, king of Lydia, was the chief leader. And so Lydia was the very ancient capital, and Sardis was its capital. So it appeared to have been civilized and industrious, and also wealthy, practicing commerce, and agricultural, manufacturers, and acquainted with various arts. And so we can see the growth of those things. Like other nations of Asia, the people were lax in their morals. Croesus had the reputation of being the wealthiest of men at that time. And so Croesus was unable to withstand the arms of Cyrus. And Cyrus would suddenly appear before Sardis, took it, and condemned Croesus to be burned to death. And so this was around 546 BC. So before the funeral of Pyre,
Croesus cried out, "So long, so long, so long." And this aroused the curiosity of that of Cyrus because of what he had said. So Cyrus learned that Solon, Athenian a sage, was at the capital city, Sardis. So Croesus showed him all his wealth, expecting a compliment, asked him who was the happiest man he had ever seen, and Solon named two observed Greeks. Then he remarked that he could pronounce no man happy as long as he lived, because no man could see what might happen to him before he died. And so when this matter was reported to Cyrus, he spared the life of Croesus and made him a friend. So during the next year, the Persians under Harpagus suppressed a rebellion of the Lydians under Pactyus and subjugated the Ionian cities, the Carians, and also the Lycians. So the king of Cilicia voluntarily acknowledged the Persian supremacy. So next, here comes Cyrus. He defeats the army of Leonidas. Then Babylon then Babylon itself surrenders in October 539 BC to the Persian general Gorbarus, the Darius of Daniel 6. So from 538 BC, Cyrus dated his years as the king of Babylon and the king of countries. So with the fall of the capital of Babylon, provinces in Syria fell to that of the Persians. And so that helps us to understand some more about them and how that the Medes and the Persians Babylon was divided among that of the Medes and the Persians. So that brings us down to the religion contributed significantly to the fall of that of Babylon. Okay, we will lost being somewhere along the way, and so we will go here and we will pause our recording and take a 15-minute break. Recording. Everybody got recording? Okay, we got down to point number 3. Religion contributed significantly to that of the fall of Babylon. I'm gonna look at something right quick to make sure that. Okay. I have so many sets of notes, so trying to make sure I didn't leave out something other. So when we think about how the religion contributed, Babylon was surrounded by walls with enormous height and strength. Let me see. It sounds like I'm getting feedback. Yeah, I am. Okay, that's the reason why. You can still hear me, right, Jim?
Yes.
It is said to have been provisions for 20 years. That's the reason why they had those walls. And also it was for strategy. Cyrus could not have taken Babylon for a long period of time if in reference to that, if at all, if they could have taken it at all. Can't pick up anything right here for some reason or another. There you go. So the priest Marduk was directly responsible for the fall of Babylon, and so they were happy to welcome Cyrus. Marduk in the Old Testament, Merodach, was the city god of Babylon, and so his temple was called Lofty House. And after Hammurabi had made Babylon the chief city of all Babylon, its god increased in importance until he absorbed the attributes of the early gods and displaced them in great myths. The speculative philosophers of the Neo-Babylonian period went so far as to identify all the early gods with him, elevating his worship in a sort of Hindu theism. And so Marduk had some hymns and that were sung to him that had come down to us. The priest of Marduk was very angered because now Mondas had neglected them for the foreign deities. And so they made possible Cyrus's entrance into that of Babylon. And so the priests of Marduk had provided a righteous ruler. And so Cyrus described the matter for a righteous ruler. He pronounced the name Cyrus, king of Anshan, and declared him to be or come the ruler of the world. And so Cyrus showed his cooperation with the Babylonian priests by going through the prescribed ritual of the great New Year festival. And Cyrus restored to his own shrines the gods which had been taken to Babylon by Nabonidus. This made the people of those places quite happy. And the priests of Marduk was also happy. So they were happy because those gods were being removed from that of Babylon. And so even among those idolatrous people, they were jealous in reference to the gods that they had. They didn't want anybody else's gods over there where they were. So Cyrus gathered all their former inhabitants and returned to them their habitation. And so Cyrus was a humanitarian, so he was wise as well as humane, and his policy was respected. With respect to captive people, exhibited both aspects of his character. And so it helped them to understand that because in reference to the different gods that they had. And again, we call upon their gods in reference to that. They were idolatrous folks, idolaters, I think, it was idolatry, idols. And so that brings us to the rulers of Persia as they concerned God's people consisted of a number of things. And number one is that one of the things that concerned them was, I can't get my computer to do anything, was that of Cyrus. Now Cyrus had reigned for 29 years, 558 to 529 BC. And Cyrus is mentioned a number of times by that of Isaiah and Daniel and that of Ezra. So we have the prophets of that of the Old Testament mention him. And so he conquered Media and also Lydia in 546 BC and also Babylonia. So Egypt also remained the allies of Croesus. And Cyrus entrusted into the hands of his sons Cambyses the campaign against Egypt. And so Cyrus personally set out to swell a revolt of nomads on the eastern frontiers of the empire. This should have been a skirmish, but Cyrus was wounded and died. And so his body was carried back to Pasargadae, one of the capital cities, and his body was covered with that of wax, according to the Persian custom, and placed in a stately, dignified tomb, which was guarded faithfully for 2 centuries. Now, notice, so we're introduced there among that of the Persian people that this is how that they prepared that of their dead. They covered them with wax. Next time you go to a wax museum, you better not watch out. It might be a body there discovered with wax. But we don't do that anyway. But the tomb is still standing, but the contents have long been removed. Again, we go back to archaeological finds and so forth. The few world conquerors have been regarded as high as that of Cyrus. The Persian actually called upon him as father. And the Greeks, though, regarded him as master and lawgiver. So the Jews regarded him as God's anointing. So here's someone, as we stop and think, because also, as we said, he's mentioned by that of Daniel and Ezra and Isaiah. And so we find that here his own people called him father, but the Greeks looked upon him as a master, as a lawgiver, and the Jews regarded him as the anointed of God. So when Alexander the Great found Cyrus's tomb, that it had been rifled, and that is, he ordered that the body be replaced and the contents of the tomb be restored as far as possible. And so that's kind of respect that this Cyrus had, and we can see also as we look because of how that he is again mentioned by that of the prophets of the Jewish people. And then you have Cambyses, 529 to 522 BC, and he reigned for 7 years. When the news of
Cambyses' father's death reached Cambyses, he assumed his father's full title, that is King of Babylon, King of Lands. Now, there was a second son. His name was Barduja. And he was entrusted with the eastern provinces of the empire. And but disorder broke out on all sides, and so this disorder had disorders have commonly been considered an attempt to Barduja to challenge Cambyses' right to the throne. And so Cambyses is reported to have slain his brother. And so Cambyses continued the religious policy inaugurated by his father, Cyrus, except in some cases, gifts to the temple diminished. And so with Egypt under control, Cambyses pressed on to the African area with a land expedition of about 50,000 men. And so then he made a personal expedition into Ethiopia, but the army ran short of provisions and were forced to retreat. And so during this time, Cambyses received news of trouble at home. Now you stop and you think about that he makes this personal expedition into that Ethiopia because they did not have the provisions. And so I wonder, and this is my wondering, that if Ethiopia did not really have the provisions, enough provisions even for themselves. And so that might have been one of the reasons, is because the Ethiopians were taking care of all of themselves, their own armies and their own people. They weren't leaving anything behind for that of the Cambyses people to get. And so during his time, he goes back because of the troubles at home. And the throne had been usurped by one who claimed to be his brother, Barduja. Cambyses determined to return home. So on his way home, he received confirmation of the report of the usurpation of the throne by the pretender, Gayt, who had assumed the name of Barduja or Smyrtus, S-M-E-R-D-E-S, Smyrtus. So and that's the name that we sometimes use more than any other, Smyrtus. Now, this new ruler, though, was accepted by nearly all the provinces of the empire. Now, remember, Cambyses is all fighting. And so the pretender attempted to win the favor of the people by remitting taxes for 3 years. And so he also attempted a religious reform. Now, again, we have to remember the jealousies of reference to the gods that different people had. But Cambyses, he never reaches home. His death resulted from an accidental self-inflicted wound when mounting his horse. And so the Persian record suggests suicide. But Cambyses suffered from epileptic fits, as the understanding. So there are evidences of insanity in his latter days, particularly if the reputed atrocities committed in Egypt after his return from the Ethiopian campaign over the Big League. After Cambyses' death, the army remained loyal to the government, which he represented. And so 2 months later, the pretender, Gayt, was executed. And Darius, the son of his Hystaspes, was to become the next Persian monarch. And so the opposition, though, the Samaritans to the rebuilding of Jerusalem continued through the wide reign of Cyrus and during the reign of his successor, Cambyses. And so Cambyses took the throne of the pharaohs at the first of the Manetho dynasty of 27 Persian, that is, during his conquest of Egypt. And Cambyses' presence there and the cautions necessary because of the Egyptian campaigns may in part for the success of the Samaritans in stopping the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple. Now we find that in Exodus, Ezra chapter 4, chapter 5, and verse 24. And so there's some problems there in reference to that in building that of the Jerusalem temple. And so this may be some of the reasoning that's behind that. Now you had Smyrtus, Galmata, 522 to 521 BC. He served for 8 months. So after Cambyses' death, the army remained loyal and they moved to rid the nation of Smyrtus. Within 2 months, Smyrtus was executed.
So that brings about Darius Estappus, 521 to 486 BC, 35 years he reigned. Now, it's interesting because as he reigns, that we want to go over and look at a couple of the prophets. Go over with me to Haggai chapter 1 and verse 1. The Bible there says, in the second year of Darius, king, in the 6th month, in the first day of the month, came the word of the Lord to Haggai, the prophet of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, a governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Joshedek, the high priest, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, This people say, the time is not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. And then if we were to turn to that of Zechariah, chapter 1 and verse 1, in the 8th month, in the second year of Darius, came the word of the Lord unto Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddu, the prophet, saying, The Lord hath been sore displeased with your fault. And so here it was that he reigned during that time. The temple was completed, though, in his during his reign. And so this is Darius Estappus, during whose reign the rebuilding of the temple was completed in 516 BC. And so the first Jewish leader in the rebuilding of the temple was Zerubbabel, or these are good now, Sheshbazzar would be. Now let's go in reference to that, go all the way back to the book of Ezra. And let's see, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Ezra. There you go. I missed it. Go over to Ezra, okay. Chapter 1. First and Second Chronicles of Ezra. Oh, Ezra. Okay, chapter 1 of Ezra, and down in verse 8. This is what is said there. He gives a list of people in chapter 2, but in verse 8, he says, even those did Cyrus, king of Persia, bring forth by the hand of Mithridates, the treasure, in number of them was Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. And so he mentions there in reference to that of Zerubbabel. But in chapter 5 and even in verse 14, we find that it says, In the vessels also of gold and silver, the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple that was in Jerusalem, and brought them into the temple of Babylon, those did Cyrus the king take out of the temple of Babylon, and they were delivered unto one whose name was Sheshbazzar, whom he had made governor. And then in verse 16, he says, Then came the same Sheshbazzar, and laid the foundation of the house of God, which is in Jerusalem, and since that time, even until now, hath it been in building, and yet it is not finished. So they were trying to get it finished. And so Zerubbabel, or Sheshbazzar, left Babylon about 535 BC, when Cyrus decreed that the Jews might return to their home country and rebuild their temple and their city. And so the total number of Jews who returned is given to us in Ezra chapter 2, down in verses 64 to 66. It says, The whole congregation together was 40,002,303 score. Besides this, servants and their maids, of whom were 7,337, and there were among them 200 singing men and singing women. Their horses were 736, their mules 245, and their horses were 736, and their mules were 245. Oh, here it is. Their camels 435, and their asses 6,720. So you can see there the total number of what was being returned. And so there were they were primarily of the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. We don't many times mention Levi, but Levi, remember, is the priestly tribe. And so they had to have the priestly tribe in order to be able to worship correctly. So these Jews constituted the most earnest, godly, and enterprising members of the captive nation. So it took them 4 months to traverse the 700 miles between Babylon and Jerusalem. Ezra chapter 3 and verse 1. And when the 7th month was come, and the children of Israel were in the cities,
the people gathered themselves together as one man to Jerusalem, it says there. Then down in verse 8, though it says, now in the second year of their coming into the house of God at Jerusalem, in the second month became Zerubbabel, the son, Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, the son of Zodak, and the remnant of their brethren, the priests and the Levites, and they that were come out of captivity into Jerusalem, and appointed the Levites from 20 years and upward to set forward the work of the house of the Lord. And so 1 year after they reached their country, they began to rebuild the temple, as Ezra 3 and verse 8. And the Samaritans, descendants of surviving Israelites and foreigners, became opposed to the work. In Ezra chapter 4, they opposed the work. And so Daniel's solemn fast in Daniel chapter 10 may have been the occasion of his hearing of the opposition to that of the work. And so Daniel's fast was the occasion of his receiving the visions contained in chapters 11 and 12. So when Darius, his Staples, came to the throne, the prophet Haggai and Zechariah strongly urged their countrymen to resume the work, which was immediately resumed. In Ezra chapter 4, verse 24, I read Haggai 1 and Zechariah 1. But in Ezra chapter 4, down in verse 24, he says, then ceased the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem, so it ceased until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Then chapter 5 there, beginning in verse 1, he says, then the prophets, Haggai, the prophets, and Zechariah, the son of Iddu, prophesied unto the Jews that were in Judea and Jerusalem in the name of God of Israel unto them. Then rose up Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeush, and the son of Jodak, and began to build the house of God, which is at Jerusalem, with them, even the prophets of God helping them. At the same time came to them Tatnai, governor of the side of the river of Shethar-Boznai, and their companions, and said thus unto them, who have commanded you to build this house and to make up this wall? Then said we unto them after this manner, what are the names of the men, and make this building? But the eye of their God was upon the elders of the Jews, that they could not cause them to cease till the matter came to Darius, and then they returned answer in letter concerning this matter. A copy of the letter that Tatnai, governor of this side, beyond the river, the Shethar-Boznai, and his companions, Apharsachites, which were in the side of the river, sent unto Darius the king. They sent a letter unto him, wherein was written thus, unto Darius the king of all peace, be it known unto the king that we went into the province of Judea to the house of the great God, which is built with great stone, and timber is laid in the walls of their works fast on, and prospereth in their hands. Then asked we those elders, and asked them unto thus, who commanded you to build this house and to make up these walls? We asked their names also to certify that we might write the names of the men that were the chief of them. And thus they returned us answers, saying, we are the servants of God of heaven, and build a house that was built these many years ago, which the great king of Israel built and set up. But after that, our fathers had provoked the God of heaven unto wrath, and he gave unto them the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this house and carried people away into Babylon. But in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, this king Cyrus, made a decree to build this house of God, and the vessels also of gold and silver of the house of God. Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple that was Jerusalem and brought them into the temple of Babylon. Those did Cyrus the king take out of the temple of Babylon. They were delivered unto one whose name was Sheshbazzar, whom he had made governor, and said unto him, take these vessels, carry them into the temple that is in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be built in this place. Then he says, then came the same Sheshbazzar and laid the foundation of the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. And since that time, even now, that it has been built in building, and yet it is not finished. So it had not been finished. So here it is that they were asking all of this. So the Ahasuerus of Ezra 4 and verse 6 is thought to be Cadus, to whom reference has already been made. But The Artaxerxes of Ezra chapters 4 and verse 7 is thought to be pseudo-Smyrtus, to whom a reference has been already made. So this means that the enemies wrote letters to Capus and pseudo-Smyrtus, respectively, warning them that the Jews were rebuilding the rebellious city. And Smyrtus, Artaxerxes, ordered the work to cease. Chapter 4 there, verses 17 to 24. And about this time, Tatnai, the Persian governor of the whole district, visited Jerusalem. We read chapter 5. And Tatnai learned of the Cyrus edict and caused a search to be made at Babylon, then at Metha, or as they call it, Ebantana, the capital of Media. And here the edict was found, chapters 5 and chapter 6 of the book of Ezra. And so Darius, the Histapus, ordered the work to be resumed. Back over, if we go to chapter 6 now, see, all this is taking place. And so then beginning chapter 6 and verse 6, it says, now therefore, Tatnai, governor beyond the river of Shethar-Boznai, and your companions, the Apar-Sachites, which are beyond the river, be far from thence. Let the work of the house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews build this house of God in this place. Moreover, I make a decree that ye shall do to the elders of these Jews for the building of this house of God, that of the king's goods, even of the tribute beyond the river, forthwith expenses be given unto these men, that they be not hindered. And that which they had need of, both young bullocks and rams and lambs, and the burnt offerings of the God of heaven, wheat and salt and wine and oil, and according to the appointment of the priests which are at Jerusalem, let it be given day by day, he says, without fail, he points out to them, that they may offer sacrifices, sweet savors unto the God of heaven, and pray for the life of the king and his sons. And also I have made a decree that whosoever shall alter this word, let timber be pulled down from his house, and being set up, let him be hanged thereof, and let his house be made a dunghill for this. And the God that has caused his name to dwell there, destroy all things and people that shall put to their land, to alter and to destroy this house of God, which at Jerusalem I, Darius, have made a decree, let it be done with speed. Then Tatnai, governor of this side of the river, Shethar-Boznai, and their companions, according to that which Darius the king had sent, so they did speedily. And the elders of the Jews built, and they prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet, and Zechariah the son of Iddu, and they built and they finished it according to the commandment of the God of Israel, and according to the commandment of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month Adar, which was in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. So it helps us to see there in reference to what they had gone through into that of the building and resuming that of the work at the point where they had built that of the temple. So we find it was completed at the 6th year of Darius. And so from Nebuchadnezzar's first invasion to the edict of Cyrus were 70 years. And so from the utter destruction of Jerusalem and the temple to the rebuilding of the temple were also 70 years. So the Babylonians, much unwilling to bear the yoke of the Persians, had slightly prepared a revolt over a period of years. So the seat of royalty had been removed to Shushan of Susa, and this added to the Babylonian chart. Babylon, through its prepared revolt, was fast approaching its end, and so Zechariah sent a solemn warning to those Jews that yet remain in Babylon to leave the doomed city without delay. Over in the book of Zechariah, the prophet in chapter 2, let's see if I can get it over there. Zechariah, yes, chapter 2. Begin in verse 6. We find that Zechariah here says, ho, come forth and flee from the land of the north, saith the Lord, for I have spread you abroad as the four winds of heaven, saith the Lord. Deliver thyself, O Zion, that dwellest with the daughter of Babylon. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, after the glory hath sent me unto the nations which spoil you, for he that toucheth you toucheth the apple of his eye, he says. And watch him, for behold, I will shake my hand upon them, and they shall be a spoil to their servants. And ye shall know the Lord of hosts hath sent me. And so the land of north is that of Babylon. So the prophecies of Isaiah were to soon be fulfilled, Isaiah 13. And we find that this is 100 years before its rise. The Medes almost an unknown people. And we find that Isaiah, though, tells that Babylon supersedes Assyria, Isaiah 14, verse 25, and Media supersedes Babylonian, chapter 13, verse 17. And so Babylon passes away forever, chapter 13, verses 19 to 22 in the book of Isaiah. And so the Babylonians carried their prepared revolt into action during the reign of Darius. And so Darius' might had failed to take the city, but for a strategy and act of self-sacrifice on part of one of his principal officers, we find that Zopyrus, having cut off his nose and ears and mangled his body, presented himself to the Babylonians on pretense of having been cruelly treated by his master. So the Babylonians gave him chief command of their armies. And so Zophirus then gave the city into the hands of that of Darius. So the Babylon, the beauty of the Chaldeans, it failed. Its walls, formerly 200 cubits high. Now, if we were to say that's 18 inches, so we're talking about 200, 300 feet high, were lowered to 50. Its 100 gates were removed. Its houses were given to plunder. 3,000 of the ringleaders of Babylon was impaled. The fall of Babylon came about the time the Jews were celebrating the completion of the temple. Babylon is fallen, never to rise again. So after the capture of that of Babylon, Darius, his stepson, began a series of wars with that of Greece. Now, the Greek colonies on the shores of Asia Minor is called Ionians, I-O-N-I-E-N-S, in the paper. Okay. Okay. I didn't move them when I was supposed to move them. And okay. And so he captured, he's going to start these wars with that of Greece. The Greek colonies on the shore of Asia Minor, it's called Ionians, had revolted against Persia and joined with the mother country. And so Darius, his staples, mustered a gigantic force of men and sea to subdue both the colonies in revolt and the mother country of Greece. So Darius' first fleet was wrecked at Mount Athos. His second fleet ravaged the Greeks, and the Athenians met his army on the plains of Marathon and, headed by the Miltiades, defeated them with a great slaughter. And so Persia was defeated by Greece. Okay, but remember now we got these kingdoms that Daniel has prophesied about that's got to come to be. So Darius Histipius was prevented from prosecuting further war against Greece by revolt in Egypt, and soon after that by his death. So he is considered to be the ablest prince that ever sat on the throne of Persia. He added a few provinces to the empire, like India, Thrace, Macedonia, the islands of the Ionian Sea. And so at his death, the empire extended from the Indus to the Aegean and from the Scythia, now Russia, to the Cataract of the Nile. So his great ability was exerted chiefly in consolidating his vast empire. He divided it into 20 different provinces and set up a governor over each one of them. And so we find that he was, as we said, a great leader. Then we have Xerxes, 486 to 465 BC. He reigned for 21 years. Now, Xerxes is the Ahasuerus, whose father who chose Esther, a Jewish maiden, as queen. So that would lead us to go over to that of the book of Esther and see the background of that. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Job. All right, it's over here somewhere. Esther. Come on, Esther. Don't know where Esther is. Okay, in Esther, chapter 2, verse 16 and 17. He says he says, so Esther, and I'm going to go back to verse 15. Now, when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go into the king, she required nothing but what Hegai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all of them that looked upon her. So Esther was taken unto the king Ahasuerus into his house and royal, and in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen ahead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast unto all the princes and his servants, even Esther's feast, and he made a release to the providence and gave gifts according to the state of the king. And so we see how that Xerxes was treating her. Okay, and let me throw my pieces of paper over there. I do have a note here when we was talking about Babylonian a while ago that Babylon today is a short distance from Baghdad. The Medes and the Persians used to punish Babylon. The Arabs hesitate to go to the ruins even to the day. And so there's a note that we made some time ago. So here we have that of Xerxes, and so the Esther, the international commentary on Esther by Patton reads, he says, for the interpretation of the book, it is important to determine at the outset who is the king that is called Ahasuerus. On this point, until recently, opinions have differed widely. This controversy has been brought to a close by the decipherment of the Persian monuments in which the name Xerxes appears in such a form as to leave no doubt that he is the king who is meant by Ahasuerus. So the commentary further states, with the identification of Ahasuerus with Xerxes, all the statements of the book of Esther agree. He was a Persian king who also ruled over Media. Ezra, his empire extended from India to Ethiopia and contained 127 provinces. It also included the Isle of the Mediterranean. His capital was at Susa and in Elam. And this is all true of Xerxes, but of no other Persian monarch. So the character of Ahasuerus, as portrayed in the book of Esther, also agrees with the account of Xerxes given by Herodotus and other Greek historians. For these reasons, there is general agreement, according to modern scholars and the Jewish, Catholic, and Protestants, and by Ahasuerus, that by Ahasuerus, the author of the book of Esther, means Xerxes. And so Xerxes was the successor of Darius Hystaspes. So his chief object seemed to have been to keep up with the show and state of sovereignty. He is known in history chiefly in connection with his invasion, though, of that of Greece. And Herodotus, born about the same time, 485 BC, says that no fewer than 5 million Persians accompanied him in his expedition. Now, Josephus states that a numerous body of Jews made up a part of that host. Now, that's what Josephus says. It was on this occasion that the Persians were opposed at Thermopylae by Leonidas, one of the kings of Sparta, which were only 300 followers, drove back the mighty mass again and again until they had slain 20,000. So the Persians was defeated by that of the Greeks at Alamis under the celebrated Theostocles. And Xerxes returned to Persia, leaving behind his general, Mardonius, who fared no better. And so in one day, the Persians were defeated by the land at Plataea in Bolotia by the Sea of Micah in Asia Minor. And so from this time on, no Persian ever crossed over the Hellespont. And so when we think about all of these people that are that's taking place, then we come to one of the other rulers, and his name is Artaxerxes Longimanus, 465 to 425 BC, and he reigned for 41 years. Now, Artaxerxes was a son of Xerxes.
And he lasted, as I said, 41 years. That is a long time that he lasted. And he was called Longomanus from the length of his hands, which is said to have been such that when he stood erect, they reached his knees. I don't know about that. That would be too bad. I can reach down about 6 inches above my knees. So, but in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, Ezrael, the scribe, set out for Jerusalem with a company of 6,000 or 7,000. In Ezrael, chapter 7, we find down in verse 7 that he points this out to us. He says, and there went up some of the children of Israel, the priests and Levites and the singers and the trial porters, and the Nethivims to Jerusalem in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, the king. So that helps us to understand who the king is. And so 80 years had elapsed since Zerubbabel and his company had returned to the holy city. And most of those who had accompanied Zerubbabel were dead. And so Ezra's chief object in returning was to reestablish fully and firmly that of the law of Moses. And so as a ready scribe, chapter 7 here and down back to verse 6, then this Ezra went up from Babylon, and he was a ready scribe of the law of Moses, which the Lord God of Israel had given, and the king granted him all his requests according to the hand of the Lord his God upon him. And so we find that Ezra arranged and he edited and he published the book of the law, by which it is probably meant the legalistic portion of the Torah or Pentateuch. And so it appears that up to this time, copies of the law was very scarce. 13 years after Ezra arrived in Jerusalem, that's the 20th, that would be the 20th year of Artaxerxes, then we have Nehemiah made his first visit to help in the work of the restoration. In the book of Nehemiah, chapter 2 and verse 1, and it came to pass in Mount Nisan, in the month Nisan, and in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, that's king, that wine was before him, and I took upon the wine and gave it unto the king. Now I had not been before time sad in his presence. And so Nehemiah was the cupbearer, as we would say, of that of the king. And so this was a highly honorable, influential office that was there, and doubtless a lucrative one. Ezra was in Jerusalem at the time Nehemiah arrived, according to Nehemiah chapter 8. So Nehemiah had obtained a limited leave of absence in order to assist in this great work. And so at the end of that 12-year stay, Nehemiah returned to Persia and assumed his duties at the court of Susa. Now back to chapter 2 of Nehemiah, as we'll say, we read verse 1, down in verse 2, it says, "Wherefore the king said unto me," talking about Nehemiah, "Why is thy countenance sad, seeing that thou art not sick? This is nothing else but sorrow of heart." Then I was very sore afraid, and said unto the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my countenance be sad when the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lie waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire?" Then the king said unto me, "For what dost thou make request?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said unto the king, "If it please the king, and if thy servant have found favor in thy sight, that thou wouldest send me unto Judah, unto the city of my father's sepulchre, that that's what he says that I may build it." And the king said unto me, the queen also set him by him, "For how long shall thy journey be? And when wilt thou return?" So it pleased the king to send me, and I sent him a time. In other words, he wanted to know. We go over chapter 13 of the book of Nehemiah, down in verses 6 and 7. The Bible says, "But in all this time was not I at Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, came I unto the king, and after certain days obtained I leave of the king. And I came to Jerusalem and understood of the evil that Elisha did for Tobiah in preparing him a chamber in the courts of the house of the Lord," he said. And so later, how much later is not known, Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem, chapter 13, verse 7 points that out to us. And whether or not he continued in Jerusalem for the rest of his life is not known.
But the book of Malachi should be read in conjunction with Nehemiah. With Malachi and Nehemiah, the Old Testament period actually comes to that of a close. So let us turn over and look at the book of Malachi, because it does bring us, as we say, to the close of the books of the Old Testament. And we find that when we look at the book of Malachi, we find that his name actually means my messenger. And so this is about 100 years after the return, and the temple has been rebuilt 520 BC. And Ezra has returned in 458 BC. So Artaxerxes had allowed Nehemiah to return and build the walls of the city around 444 BC. And so Greek culture, now here's the point, Greek culture began to really boom in 480 BC. As you think about that, remember that this here is this book that most likely he wrote this book 445 to 432 BC. So during that little time there, the culture is beginning to bloom. And Europe was beginning to succeed Asia as an intellectual center. And there was serious economic depression in Palestine. We find that they were called upon to repent and return. And social order had seriously broken down with the failing of marriages, injustice on every side. From a religious standpoint, when Malachi was writing, the people had lost faith in God's promises through Haggai and Zechariah of a future glory and blessing. And idolatry had moved from outward idols to those obstructions of the heart, such as materialistic covetousness and selfishness. The priesthood was misleading the people. The people were holding back offerings that should have been given to Jehovah. The ritualistic empty worship they offered was backed by cast-off wives and heathen entanglement. And so then you had this man Malachi. His name meant my messenger. He had the courage to attack such problems as divorce and prophecies of the concerning of that of John D. Mercy. And he, as God's spokesman, as the Jews, has provided one more challenge to keep the law of Moses. And so we find that that's the connection that we see. And so when we look at all this, we begin to look, because now as we get through with that, looking at the Old Testament and getting ready to go between that and the Testament, we need to realize that Artaxerxes II, he was king or in charge 425 BC for 25 days. And then he had Sarganus, he was there 6 months, 425 to 424. And then Darius II was there for 19 years. And then Artaxerxes II was 66 years. Artaxerxes III, 21 years. Arces, 2 years. Darius III, 6 years. And then you had the Battle of Arbela and the overthrow of Persia by Alexander the Great, 331 BC. So there are some things that we need to observe in the time that we have left. We have 15 minutes left, and we'll be through with unit number 2. Some of the observations relative to that of Zoroastrianism, that is the religion of the Persians. And I have a collection of some papers in reference to this. And I thought it's interesting, but to understand what's going on and what influences that have been upon that of the people, the Jewish people, then we have to understand something about Zoroaster. Now, Zoroaster was a reformer or a restorer of ancient Persian religion. And it flourished during the reign of Darius the Second. Zoroaster lived in retirement in the Elburz Mountains for the first 20 years of his life. He was in retirement the first 20 years of his life. In retirement for the first 20 years of his life. That's pretty good. If I could be in retirement the first 20 years of my life, but during that time, to be serious, he was supposed, according to his followers, to have been taken up into heaven where God's law was revealed to him. So this tradition had its origin, no doubt, in the revelation of the law of God to Moses on Mount Sinai. You see the similarities. The Hebrew scriptures were well known in that of Persia at this time. And Zoroaster seemed to have labored to restore the religion of Persia, which had either become greatly neglected
or had been corrupted by image worship. And again, notice we talked about earlier how that there were those who were kind of jealous of all the other types of gods and religions and so forth. But Zoroaster's system of religion consisted of, not, first of all, there was one eternal God. That's a capital G. That's what he believed. And number two, that there are two principles in the universe. That is, the one of good and the other of evil. And as we would stop and think, well, there's God and there's the devil. Now, the emblem of good is called Ormuzd, and it was light. And the emblem of bad was called Ahriman, which was darkness. And so between these two opposites, there was a contest which would continue, which would continue to the end of the world. And so at the judgment, the followers of both, that is of light and of that of darkness, would be judged and separated forever. So the good would be rewarded and the evil would be punished. In the ultimate end, the good would prevail. Now, light, Ormuzd, was always worshipped in the presence of fire. Darkness was held in this station. So when you stop and you look at that, we see, that here is their ancient religion and how that they believe that basically there's one God, there's good and there's evil in the world. There's light and there's darkness, and there's going to be a judgment at the very end, and the good's going to be rewarded, and the evil is going to be punished. But in the very end, the good is going to prevail. And so one would immediately observe that many things peculiar to Zoroastrianism have been derived from that of the Jewish scripture. Now, like we said, he believed, Zoroaster, stop for a moment and think again what was said in reference to him, that he was supposed to have gone up and, according to his followers, to have been taken in heaven where God's law was revealed to him. It is the idea of the revelation of the law of God given to Moses. And so the same idea. So he had all these same beliefs in reference that you find in that of the Jewish scripture. The doctrines of Zoroaster were set forth in Zendanesta, the sacred book of the Persians. It's called Avesta, A-V-E-S-T-A, Avesta. Now, Darius, his staples, fostered the creed of Zoroaster. And at Zoroaster's death, Darius became the arch magus, or as we would call, he would be called under the Persian rule, a high priest. And so and because of that, the religion spread very rapidly. And so the revival of the Persian religion had little effect in purifying the morals of the Persian nation. The manner of the court was marked with excessive luxury and revolting accord. The barbarity of women was frightful. The woman's character was most depraved, and yet their influence was great. Formerly, the Persians had been remarkable for the purity and simplicity of their manners, and their children had been taught from childhood to repeat the phrases of truth and justice. But excessive wealth and prosperity were sapping the foundations of the ancient virtue. And we see that happening all the time. The nation was seeking into a state of ultra weaknesses and corruption, which caused its ultimate fall to that of the Greeks. And so that brings us in retrospect some observations in reference to them. Let me turn my paper there again. We'll finish that. Now, the Persian empire dates from 536 BC to 332 BC. So we're talking a period of 200 years. Now, this 200 years may be logically divided into two different periods. Number one, the first period consists of 130 years, ending with Malachi and Nehemiah. So this marks the close of the Old Testament. Now, the second period consists of the remaining 70 years. That is the period from Malachi and Nehemiah till that of Alexander the Great arrives in Jerusalem. So in the period, the first period, the 130 years,
The events that took place was, number one, Cyrus made an edict permitting the Jews to return to their home country, Ezra chapter 1. And yet, number two, of the Jews in Babylon, 42,360 returned. Those who returned was that of churchmen, patriots, the poorer class. They were not the wealthiest or the socially prominent. And not only that, but they had a new name. They were called Judeans or Jews. The much larger Jewry, as we call it, Jewry, Jews, were left behind. All the people who returned hated idolatry. So these Jews returned to a hotbed of hostilities in the western corner of the Philistines. And in the south, the Edomites had taken of Judah the territory of Hebron. They had pushed their settlements along the Jordan Valley. And then in the east were the Moabites and the Ammonites. And on the north were the mongrel Samaritans. Only Jerusalem was unoccupied by enemies. The Samaritans became bitter enemies. So Esther, a Jewish, was married to Ahasuerus or Xerxes. Ezra, who is a ready scribe, left Babylon with a company during the reign of Artaxerxes. 13 years after Ezra went up from Susa, Nehemiah also went up from Babylon to Jerusalem, and this was the 20th year of Artaxerxes. At the end of that 12-year stay, Nehemiah returned to Susa. So later, though, Nehemiah, as we've read, returned to Jerusalem. Now, in that second period, the last 70 years, an overview reflects some things. Number one, the last 70 years were a period of peace. There was no hostilities between Mesopotamia and that of Egypt. The great king ruled both lands. Otherwise, Palestine would have been abolished. The course of Israel was downward. There was a decline in the national tone and the religious life. Formalism was doing its daily work. All about the middle of the 70 years, Judas, the elder of that of the high priest, slew his brother Joshua within the temple. Joshua was favored over Judas for high priest by Vegas, the resident representative of Persia. So the high priesthood continued to grow in dignity and power. The high priest became not only the sacred head of the church, but also the sacred head of the state. So Jewish pride and Persian policy united to enhance the importance and the dignity of the office. So the Sanhedrin probably originated during this period, and we'll talk more in reference about that part. Anything? Trying to get through. Mama said I could get through early. When I got through, we got 5 minutes. Lord willing, next Thursday night, we will talk about a historical survey of the Hebrew people from the beginning of the Grecian period until the rise of the Roman Empire. And first, we shall take a look at the Greek city-state during the Persian period. It is 536 to 332 BC. Help us to understand more and more about the intertestamental period, what went on. Hopefully, the next week I will have more of these notes finished, and I'll be able to send those to you. Any questions or comments that you may have?
Thank you, Bobby.
About gone. Jim, hope you get your refrigerator. I mean your computer working.
I'm gonna call Doug tomorrow.
All right, then. You have a good night. God bless.
Thank you very much. Oh.